Hello, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to this episode of The Green Room, a collaboration between Washtenaw County and Ann Arbor CTN Television. Today, our guest is Dr. Mike Shriberg, Executive Director of the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes Regional Center, which happens to be located right here in Ann Arbor. We'll be discussing NWF's Vanishing Seasons campaign. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, for those who might not be familiar, what is the National Wildlife Federation?
Yeah, so we're an organization that exists to really unite all people who care about the outdoors. Our mission is to ensure that wildlife thrive in an ever-changing world and to reverse America's wildlife crisis.
Great. And in a sentence or two, if possible, what is your Vanishing Seasons campaign?
Yeah, it's a campaign to engage the hunter and angler community in the fight against climate change. And we do that by showing what the impacts are to the natural resources, including fish and wildlife, that the hunter and angler community in particular is very attuned with.
Mm-hmm. I guess they're noticing changing migration patterns and home ranges, all kinds of things.
Yeah, the range of things that are happening that are noticeable by those who use the land and the water and our resources the most is really vast. I mean, it's everything from changes in seasons. I mean, we're seeing that in the fall right now, to changes in water temperature, to changes in weather patterns, and it impacts everything from the top to the bottom of the food chain. And of course, you see many of those impacts if you're out in nature and doing fishing and hunting.
Mm-hmm. They're very intimately attuned to those impacts. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, the people are probably the closest to this in many ways because of the way it impacts the form of recreation and sometimes, and for some folks, subsistence.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to point people to a publication that NWF came out with recently that's called Changing Seasons, Climate Impacts on Michigan's Hunting, Fishing, and Wildlife Heritage. And it's got a whole lot of really interesting examples of how climate change is impacting hunters and anglers. Can you give me an example, for instance, of what warmer temperatures are doing for our wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the most vivid example of that is our moose population here in the Great Lakes, which is a northern population to begin with. We have it in the Upper Peninsula, and then of course along the Lake Superior shoreline in Wisconsin and Minnesota. But our moose population is declining rapidly due to both the heat itself. This is a species adapted to cooler temperatures, and the increase in disease that's caused because many of the things that cause them problems, things like ticks, aren't dying off because we're not having as colder winters as we had before. And so there's examples kind of up and down the food chain, but moose are probably, they're an easy one to grasp, and there are way fewer moose now in Michigan than there were just a decade or 20 or 50 years ago because of this.
Another one that comes to mind immediately to me is the brook trout, right? They can't handle the warm water.
Exactly. So the cold water fisheries are really suffering, brook trout and other species of trout in particular. And, water temperatures, I mean, this is another one in some ways easy to grasp. When it's hotter out, the water temperatures are warmer. I just personally, I was up on Lake Superior over the summer, and this is not a scientific measure, but I was swimming in the water, and boy, I could be in there for about a half hour, and it was no problem. I'm used to having to run in and out of Lake Superior, even on the hottest of days. And Lake Superior had its first recorded algal blooms recently, and that's because of the water heating up. So those same effects. So think about that. That's on Lake Superior itself. Think about the inland streams and how the increased heat is affecting species like brook trout, and it's having a really devastating effect on our fisheries.
Yeah, the algal bloom situation reminds me that this climate change is layered upon other vulnerabilities that were pre-existing, such as the agricultural runoff and fragmentation causing more erosion and nutrients going into the waterways. So is it correct to say that climate change is not responsible for all the problems, but it's like a perfect storm kind of situation?
Yes, and I think I think that's a great way to think about it, and to think about it as an accelerator of those problems. So if you think of Lake Erie, and we work a lot on reducing harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, but the cause of more nutrients on the land isn't directly related to climate change. That's farmers essentially in agribusiness using too much. But what's happening due to climate change, and we've all felt this, is you have periods of drought and then intense storms. Think of our weather in the last year. It's really been characterized by droughts and intense storms, the exact predictions from climate change. Well, the intense storms wash those nutrients right off the fields and directly into the lakes. Lake Erie, similar to like we were talking about in Lake Superior, Lake Erie is a very vivid example of it. It's pollution that you can literally see from space most of the time in August and September. But the rivers and streams in your backyards, and particularly the lakes, are kind of that example on a smaller scale. And we're seeing a vast increase in algal blooms. And again, that impacts our fisheries. That impacts all the species that depend on the water.
And you mentioned the problem with the insects that carry the diseases not dying off. There's problems with deer in that respect as well, right?
That's right. There's a whole suite of diseases that are impacting deer that are kind of moving from south to north, and they're really hitting our deer population hard here in Michigan now. And again, many of these, some of the parasites, the deer would depend on cold winters to have them die back, and that's just not happening. It's actually even more pronounced in the Upper Peninsula because obviously the winters there were harsher to begin with. They haven't been as much recently, and so you're seeing less of those. You combine that with the impacts that climate is having on the browse species for deer. So the type of vegetation there, the species that are actually hard hit by drought are also some of the favorites of deer. And so you're seeing impacts to what they're eating as well as their physical health and well-being, again, caused and accelerated by climate change.
Do deer like hemlock? Because I know the hemlock woolly adelgid is spreading because of the warmer weather.
Yes, hemlock and the habitat that hemlock create, exactly. And that's another example of kind of I like to think of it as cascading effects. You often can't pin it on one particular element of climate change. And of course, climate change doesn't appear as one particular thing, right? It's not just increased heat, it's the increased storms and drought, right? And it's habitats literally moving farther north and species following that way, and other species being pushed kind of out of their range.
And things like quaking aspen, I guess, are moving north, and the ruffed grouse. I don't know what they do with the quaking aspen. Do they eat it, or is it just cover for them? Or
That's the habitat that they prefer, so they use it for all kinds of reasons.
So I'm sure the hunters aren't pleased with having to lose ruffed grouse in their area.
Exactly, a huge species for hunting. It's one of the species. I'm not a huge hunter myself, but I have gone out and experienced this and gone on a hunt for grouse, and it's quite an experience. I mean, it's a cultural experience, and it's experience to actually gather food that is healthy, can be put on the table directly, and those experiences are getting harder and harder to come by because of climate change.
And whether you're a bird watcher or a hunter, West Nile virus is spreading due to warmer weather and impacting more and more birds, right?
Yeah, we're seeing all kinds of disease hitting songbirds. West Nile is a big example of that. And again, we're seeing these diseases move farther north. And the other thing we're seeing for bird watchers, also like myself, is that the timing of flowering, the timing of insects, is not synced up with the timing of migration like it was before, right? So we're seeing birds come up maybe earlier because it's warmer, but then they're not getting the insects and the flowering that they need, or vice versa. You're seeing things come into bloom far earlier than they normally would be, and the birds haven't arrived to take advantage of it. And the insect, so it's things get completely out of sync when we're talking about this changing weather. And one other example. This is on the fishing side, and you'll see it in the report, but there's been more and more what they call blow days on the Great Lakes. And that means really rough weather days where the people who rely on the Great Lakes for their income, the charter fishing boat people, for example, they can't get out there because of the increased number of blow days. And again, that's this pattern of more unpredictable and just rougher weather is one way to put it. So another impact, economic impact. We don't know how much that actually impacts the fish species directly, but it impacts the people who rely on the fish species for their livelihood.
And the rougher weather has got to be impacting the broods, the nests of the birds, where they're very fragile, and you have these big storms that, wash things away. I would imagine that'd be really hard on them.
Yeah, you would think so. And the whole thing, if you think back to sort of your basic science classes on the water cycle, I mean, what's happening is warmer weather, warmer air holds more moisture, right? And then we're seeing these rapid changes in weather, so that moisture is expelled quickly, rapidly in violent ways.
And I was reading that extreme rain events followed by severe drought reduce the survival rate of trout, eggs, larvae, and fry. So
hmm
any kind of severe weather, I guess, is going to mess with a animal's already fragile existence.
Exactly. If the conditions, for breeding success are one thing, and now we've got something else.
And invasive species, invasive plants, I know a lot of them really like the warmer weather and they love disturbance. So if you're going to have big storms, trees coming down and such, then that's a problem too, right? For the
Yeah,
wildlife.
that's a really good point, because what you wind up selecting for are these invasive species, which tend to thrive on disturbance. They tend to thrive on edge areas and places that kind of go back and forth between dry and wet, for example. Those are areas, because invasives have to be very adaptable, almost by definition, to be invasive. And so you wind up selecting for habitats that invasives thrive in over native species when you have all these changes happening that the native species haven't adapted to. I mean, that's part of it, is that the climate here right now in Michigan is not what our native species adapted to over millennia, over millions of years. It's hard to overemphasize the impacts of that, right? Because they can't just speed up evolution to adapt to this. It's happening at a pace that's too quick for that. But invasive species come in and fill that void, and we see that with plant species in particular, but also animal species.
So, in terms of what we can do about it, I was really pleased to see the Sportsmen and Sportswomen Climate Statement of February 2021. I guess a group of more than 40 leading sporting organizations are calling on decision makers to address climate change and specifically to utilize natural climate solutions. What are natural climate solutions?
Yeah, and I know we've talked about a lot of the negative impacts of climate change, and of course those are really important to dwell on. But there is good news in the very things that help mitigate against the worst impacts of climate change are also really good for our ecosystem. So, to give a specific example, wetlands. Right. So restoration of wetlands. Wetlands are the natural buffers. When we say that there's increased storminess, water levels are going up and down, wetlands are actually kind of the solve to that, right? And that, of course, has massive impacts on species. They're the most productive species that we have in this country. And by actually restoring wetlands and letting them do their job, and actually, not just restoring, but no further degradation of wetlands, um, that has massive impacts. Restoring floodplains and the simple acts of planting trees and having more forest grow. It sounds so simple, but that act there is the best climate mitigation strategy. And this report shows that you can get about 20% of all the climate mitigation that we need in the US just through natural solutions. And to give you a sense of scale, that's the equivalent of taking every car and truck off the road in the US, right? So if we
Wow.
do our work, and there's no downside to this, you're building habitats, you're building beauty, and you're rebuilding ecosystems. So we're spending a lot of time pushing for these natural solutions. Although I want to be clear, that doesn't mean we can keep burning coal forever and all these things, but they are a key part of an overall strategy to reduce climate change impacts.
Yeah, I was reading that 1 acre wetland can store 1.5 million gallons of water, which is just amazing. And, I used to know that wetlands were important for absorbing, their sponges, but these floods we've been having lately that are just doing so much damage to the human infrastructure. Now I'm starting to understand why we need this green infrastructure to add to climate resiliency. That's a term I read a lot in the NWF literature. Do you want to just address what climate resiliency means?
Yeah, climate resiliency is, we generally mean having both our infrastructure, our nature-based infrastructure, our things that can help mitigate against the worst impacts of climate. So if we think outside this region, I think one of the easiest ways to understand it is if you look at the areas most impacted by hurricanes, they're where a shoreline is built up with concrete and hotels and all those other things, think in Florida or Texas or wherever. Now, where there's native mangrove forest in southern Florida, or where there's other areas where wetlands can thrive, you actually see much less impact from hurricanes because literally it forms a physical barrier. If we translate that to this region, fortunately, we don't have to deal with hurricanes. But if you've got these massive storms, like we had massive flooding here just a couple months ago, and we had the massive floods, particularly in Detroit and in the county surrounding Detroit. Well, if that water had fallen onto areas that still had native plants that have wetlands, that water is going to stay there and it's going to be absorbed over time and utilized over time. Right now, too often it just goes directly into pipes, goes into sewer systems, those back up, and you see the massive flooding. I mean, I-75, I believe, was underwater for days on
Hmm.
this, and that's kind of the extreme example.
Yeah. I was looking at a chart that compared the different types of natural infrastructure, and I was amazed at how much forests were just huge carbon sinks. I got to thinking about how when we look in our metropolitan area here and we have the ability to perhaps have more housing in areas where we could infill versus cutting down trees to add more housing. Those are the kind of things that I've been reading about in some of your publications, that perhaps we should be doing what we can to avoid cutting down trees.
Yeah, it makes a huge, huge impact. And I think you're right. Anywhere you look in our county and elsewhere, infill is the top way to go to address it. And but every time we take out a forest, we're actually reversing carbon sequestration. We're releasing carbon.
Hmm. So, the voice of the hunting and angling community is very important. One reason is they're politically diverse and politically influential. And in the past, I've heard that the Michigan United Conservation Clubs is the most politically influential environmental organization in Michigan. Is that still the case, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a subjective measure, but I would say they're very powerful. They are so at the National Wildlife Federation, we have an affiliate in each state. They are our state affiliate, Michigan United Conservation Clubs. And what they do is they bring together all these hunting and fishing clubs around the state. And the thing about that is it means that they're spread out in all these different districts. Their membership leans conservative. And remember, Republicans control the legislature in Michigan. And so they are very influential in those areas. And of course, the land area that they cover, their clubs, tend to be in the more rural and northern areas of Michigan. So they have people all over the place. And they've been a very, very powerful group. And we've been working with them at NWF to engage the hunter and angler community in climate. And I'd say 5 years ago, I would have been skeptical that the hunter angler community would get really engaged on climate. They'd say, well, the politics of that are tough, et cetera. That's not what we've experienced at all. The folks who are out there, the folks who are members, not just of Michigan United Conservation Clubs, but say Trout Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, all these groups that are hunter angler advocacy groups, they're seeing those changes and wanting to get involved. And so we've been really pleased with what we're calling our Changing Seasons Coalition here in Michigan, that people have gotten involved, they've gotten engaged, and it's because they're seeing the impacts and they're not seeing it as politics, they're seeing it as science, and they're seeing it as impacting, what they care about and love and what their resource base in their own community. And so there's this groundswell from the hunter angler group, and it is different. I mean, the National Wildlife Federation, because we are part of that community. Our membership's about a third Republican, third independent, a third Democratic, right?
Hmm.
If you look at other environmental groups, they lean very heavily on the Democratic side.
Mhm.
And so we're actually ones that are usually working on both sides of the aisle in quite a different way because of the member base that we come from.
Hmm. And speaking of which, I noticed frequent mention of market-based solutions, kind of as opposed to heavy, big government regulatory solutions, which I thought was very interesting. I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to. Do you have any examples of what they might be talking about?
Well, I'll give you my editorial comment, which I do think when you're talking a more conservative audience, market-based solutions are what folks look for. But if you look at what we've actually been doing or trying to get done in Congress, they are market-based solutions. So things like a carbon tax is actually the best market-based solution out there. right? Or carbon fee and dividend, to put it in a different way. So a tax that you actually, put the money back into people's pockets, so it's revenue neutral. That is market-based, because right now what we're doing, of course, is carbon doesn't have a price on it, so it's being used too much. And then, of course, when you've got cap and trade bills, which cap pollution at a certain level, and then allow companies to trade to get, if it's cheaper for them to reduce and then sell some credits to someone else, or other companies where it's really hard for them to reduce, they can buy credits from someone that's cheaper. Those are the types of market-based solutions that we're talking about. The things that I think some of the more conservatives particularly don't really like is when people are forced to use a particular technology, right? So the regulatory forcing is what you see some pushback on. There's not actually a lot of that that's politically feasible and happening anyway. But I think that's the distinction that's being made. But the language is kept intentionally pretty vague, so many things can fit into it.
Mm-hmm. The language might be vague, but it's also direct. I mean, I'm seeing things like the Hunters and Anglers Guide that NWF has says, do we want to let social pressure keep us quiet, even though we know undoubtedly that inaction means the eventual doom for our sporting pastimes? I mean,
how amazing is that, right?
Yeah.
Like that, you would not have seen that statement again 5 years ago. The hunter and angler community is fired up about this, and they're seeing the impacts in a way that is not something that most in that community would have been comfortable with, and you certainly wouldn't have seen this huge number of sportsmen and women groups signing on to a letter like that. So I think you're right to pick that out, because it's a big change, and it shows how angry and how fired up this community is, and we're trying to help sort of harness that to get to the solutions we need, the nature-based solutions and the policy solutions we need to actually both mitigate and adapt to climate change.
And the beauty of it is that so much of it is transferable to people that aren't hunters and anglers. For instance, reading that the forest lands in the U.S. provides over half the U.S. water supply. I mean, if we have healthy forests, which that'll help the hunters and anglers, but it also helps anybody who drinks water.
Exactly. Well, and you think of all the people, the hunters and anglers are a big segment of the population, but there's way more bird watchers out there than there are hunters and anglers, and there's a growing number of people who are your kayakers and paddleboarders and all these sports, and of course just hikers and walkers and people who like to observe nature just from their backyard. And to us, it's all about, can we unite these voices, because that gets you to far more than a majority of people in the U.S. and that gets you across political boundaries. I mean, that's our whole mission. That's what the National Wildlife Federation exists to do, is to kind of harness that power for good for wildlife. And if we're not addressing climate change directly, we're not doing our job, right? Because it is one of the, if not the biggest impact to wildlife species right now. Climate change, and of course changes in land use, as we were talking about before, loss of wetlands, loss of forest. Those are the things that are causing the biodiversity crisis here in the US and across the world.
Well, it's great work that you're doing, and we really appreciate it. I'm afraid we're out of time already, but we'll hopefully get people interested enough to look at your literature. Where can people go for more information on all this? Yeah,
so our website, nwf.org/Great Lakes, and that's going to have the whole range of things that we do on there. It's a great place to get started to follow up on this.
Great. So thanks so much for being here today, Mike.
Thanks so much for having me.
To watch this and any of our previous Green Room shows, starting way back in 2010, you can go to washtenaw.org/Green Room. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.